Every empire has a foundation stone. For the Benettons, it was a bicycle. In the lean years following World War II, a 20-year-old Luciano Benetton made a choice that would haunt and define his family for a century. He sold his younger brother's only means of transport to buy a second-hand, industrial knitting machine. His sister, Juliana, possessed a rare eye for color in a world that was still draped in the grays and browns of post-war recovery. She knitted a single, bright yellow sweater. It was a visual explosion. In an era of drab conformity, that sweater wasn't just clothing, it was a rebellion. They began selling from the back of a car, then a small shop. They didn't know it yet, but they had just discovered the first gilded truth of fashion. People don't buy what they need. They buy how they want to be seen. By the mid-1960s, the Benettons weren't just designers. They were industrial disruptors. Luciano realized that the traditional fashion cycle was too slow. Most companies dyed their wool before knitting it, forcing them to guess which colors would be popular months in advance. Luciano flipped the script. He perfected a process called Tinto-in-Capo, or garment dyeing. They knitted everything in a neutral, raw wool, and waited until the last possible second to dye them based on real-time sales data. If yellow was selling in Paris but failing in Rome, they could pivot in 48 hours. This was the birth of fast fashion decades before Zara or H&M existed. They had mastered the logistics of desire. The growth was viral. By the 1980s, the United Colors of Benetton was a global juggernaut. They were opening a new store every day. From 1982 to 1985, they expanded from 500 stores to 3,000. They were the first truly cool global brand. They didn't just sell sweaters. They sold a vision of a borderless, harmonious world. Luciano, Giuliano, Gilberto, and Carlo. The four siblings were now billionaires. They were the gilded face of Italian entrepreneurship, adored by the press and feared by competitors. But as the empire reached a $7 billion valuation, the family made a pivot that would change their legacy forever. They realized that selling sweaters was a fickle business. They wanted something more permanent. They wanted to own the very ground the world moved on. And that is where the colors began to bleed into the gray. Up next, the art of the shock. By the mid-1980s, Luciano Benetton realized that the world was becoming desensitized to beautiful people in expensive clothes. To keep a $7 billion empire growing, he didn't need more models. He needed a manifesto. He found it in Oliviero Toscani. Toscani was a visionary who despised traditional advertising. He convinced Luciano to stop showing the clothes entirely. Instead, they would use the company's massive advertising budget to hijack the global conversation. They rebranded as the United Colors of Benetton. But the colors were no longer just wool. They were the colors of human skin, of blood, and of social crisis. This was the birth of Shockvertising. Benetton was the first brand to understand the gilded truth of the attention economy. Outrage is the most effective form of currency. By attaching their logo to the most taboo subjects of the era, interracial intimacy, religious boundaries, and the AIDS epidemic, they ensured that every dollar spent on a billboard generated $10 in free press. In 1992, Benetton crossed a line that many believed should never be touched. They took a photo of David Kirby, an AIDS activist on his deathbed, and colorized it to look like a classical Peter painting. They slapped a green Benetton logo in the corner and put it on billboards worldwide. The backlash was nuclear. The Vatican condemned it. AIDS activists were split. Some praised the visibility. Others loathed the gilded commercialization of agony. But the numbers told a different story. Sales reached an all-time high. Benetton had successfully positioned itself as the conscience of the world. But inside the empire, a fracture was forming. The family began to believe their own myth. They thought they were untouchable moral authorities, even as the fashion world began to shift beneath their feet. Every shock has a gilded ceiling. In 2000, Benetton released a 96-page supplement titled We, on Death Row. They spent millions photographing and interviewing 26 death row inmates in the United States. This time, the world didn't just talk, it revolted. The families of the victims were outraged that their killers were being used to sell $80 sweaters. Sears, which had just signed a massive deal to carry Benetton in hundreds of US stores, cancelled the contract overnight. The death row campaign cost the company millions in lost revenue and ended the 18-year partnership with Tuscany. For the first time, the Benettons were forced to face a terrifying reality. The world was tired of being shocked. And more importantly, while the family was busy being edgy, they had neglected the business of being a brand. As the fashion empire began to wobble, the siblings looked at their mounting billions and made a fateful decision. They would stop gambling on the rainbow and start investing in grey. They moved their capital out of the changing room and into the toll booth. Up next, the diversification trap. By the late 1990s, the fashion world was changing. Zara and H&M had perfected the fast fashion model the Benettons had invented, but with lower prices and even faster turnarounds. The family realized that the rainbow was becoming a commodity. To protect their $7 billion legacy, they decided to stop chasing trends and start chasing rent. Through their family holding company, Eddie Zion, they began an aggressive diversification strategy. They didn't want to sell you a sweater. They wanted to own the infrastructure of your daily life. They bought Autogrill, the world's largest catering chain for travelers. They bought stake in airports, telecom giants, and agricultural land in Patagonia. But their gilded crown jewel was the 1999 privatization of Autostrade. For $2.5 billion, the Benettons became the landlords of Italy's motorways. This wasn't just an investment, it was a license to print money. Autostrade per l'Italia managed 3,000 kilometers of Italy's highways, nearly 60% of the entire national network. The gilded truth of this deal was a dream for the Benettons and a nightmare for the Italian public. The contract allowed them to collect billions in tolls while being responsible for the maintenance of the roads. Between 2000 and 2018, the family's wealth ballooned, fueled by an infrastructure monopoly that required almost no innovation. In the boardroom in Treviso, the family was hailed as geniuses of diversification. They were no longer the sweater people, they were the titans of Italian logistics. But in the engineering offices of Autostrade, a different story was being written. The gilded profit margins were being carved out of the very concrete and steel that held the nation together. As early as 2012, internal reports began to circulate within Atlantium, the new name for the family's infrastructure arm. These reports warned that the Morandi Bridge in Genoa, a masterpiece of 1960s engineering, was suffering from severe corrosion of its stay cables. The Morandi was unique. Its steel cables were encased in prestressed concrete. You couldn't see the rust until it was too late. Instead of a massive structural overhaul, the company allegedly opted for cosmetic repairs and monitoring. The gilded family empire was now a house of cards built on a foundation of decaying concrete. They had traded the transparency of the fashion world for the opacity of industrial maintenance. They were collecting tolls from 25 million Italians every year, unaware that the path they were traveling was slowly rotting from the inside out. On August 14, 2018, the Gilded Truth finally collapsed, and the fallout would turn a national treasure into a national disgrace. Up next, the bridge that fell. August 14, 2018. The eve of Ferragosto, Italy's biggest summer holiday. Thousands of families are on the road, their cars packed with luggage, crossing the Morandi Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge of Italy. At 11:36 a.m., during a violent thunderstorm, the unthinkable happens. In less than 10 seconds, 35 cars and 3 heavy trucks plummet 45 meters into the Polcevera River, a railway line and an industrial zone below. 43 people are killed instantly. Hundreds are left homeless as the surrounding apartment blocks are evacuated. Italy is paralyzed. The gilded infrastructure that the Benettons promised was the backbone of the nation had just become its graveyard. As the dust settled, the gilded truth began to emerge from the wreckage. This was not an act of God. It was a failure of corporate soul. Investigative magistrates seized thousands of documents from the offices of Autostrade and their engineering subsidiary, SPI. The evidence was damning. Prosecutors alleged that maintenance reports had been softened or outright falsified to avoid costly repairs that would have eaten into profits. One recorded phone call between executives featured a chilling joke about the bridge's stability. The family that once sold social consciousness through their sweaters was now the face of a corporate culture that allegedly viewed human life as a line-item expense. The backlash was unlike anything Italy had seen in the modern era. The Benetton name, once a symbol of Italian pride and artistic bravery, became a slur. Protesters hung sweaters from bridge railings. Politicians from the Five Star Movement called for the immediate revocation of autostrades, concessions without compensation. For weeks, the family remained silent. When Luciano Benetton finally gave an interview, he attempted to distance the family from the day-to-day management of the bridges. But it was too late. The gilded veil had been stripped away. To the Italian public, the Benettons were no longer the United Colors. They were the grey Negligence. The empire was bleeding. The fashion business was failing, and their infrastructure crown jewel was being seized by the state. The Benettons had built a world on the idea that they were the good billionaires. Now, they were about to find out how quickly the world can tear a statue down. Up next, the collapse of the empire. By 2024, the gilded facade didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Luciano Benetton, the 89-year-old patriarch, was forced out of retirement to address a terrifying reality. The fashion empire that once boasted a $7 billion valuation was bleeding out. In a scorched earth interview with Corriere della Sera, Luciano dropped a bomb that rocked the Italian financial world. He accused his own hand-picked CEO, Massimo Rennan, of hiding a €100 million hole in the company's accounts. The betrayal was total. Luciano claimed he had been tricked into believing the brand was breaking even, only to discover a catastrophic deficit that threatened to liquidate the entire family legacy. It was a classic gilded tragedy. A founder who stayed too long, a management team that feared the truth, and a brand that had become a ghost in its own stores. But the accounting hole was just the beginning. The Italian government, fueled by public rage over the Morandi Bridge, moved to strip the Benettons of their most profitable asset. In 2022, after years of brutal legal warfare, the family was forced to sell their stake in Autostrade per l'Atelier back to a state-backed consortium. The gilded truth of the exit was a humiliation. While they walked away with €8 billion, it was a forced divorce. They were banned from the infrastructure that had made them the gatekeepers of Italy. They were no longer the titans of industry. They were investors in exile, unwanted in their own country. In 2026, the Benetton story serves as a cautionary tale for the global elite. They failed because they forgot the fundamental rule of the gilded truth. You cannot brand yourself as the conscience of the world while neglecting the very roads your customers drive on. They were pioneers of fast fashion who were too slow to change. They were masters of shock who forgot how to inspire. They traded the vibrant, living colors of the rainbow for the cold, dead profit of gray concrete. And in the end, the concrete won. The Benettons didn't just lose a company, they lost a nation's trust. And in the world of high-stakes power, that is the one asset you can never buy back.